Thank you for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you to Francis and everybody who's been working on this project. I have about a 10 to 15 minute quick presentation, fill in some of the historical details about some of the more magical things we'll be discussing tonight. So I'll launch right in. I'll be talking about Nālandā and the classical Indian Buddhist university system, the Indian Buddhistic Enlightenment and Renaissance culture, the Tibetan Tengyur canon, its structure and contents, the uniqueness of the Tibetan canons, the relevance of the Nālandā tradition today, and the impact of translating the Tengyur, somehow in 10 minutes. We'll see what we can do. Since we're here at Tibet House, which is His Holiness the Dalai Lama's cultural center in New York, it's appropriate to start with him and what he has to say about Nālandā. He has said in the past, the Buddhist culture that flourished in Tibet can rightly be seen to be derived from the pure tradition of Nālandā. The works of the Nālandā masters are presently preserved in the Tibetan Tengyur canons. The Tengyur is truly one of Tibet's most precious treasures, a mine of understanding that we have preserved in Tibet for the benefit of the whole world. One more quote from him now, and we'll end with some quotes from him at the very end. He has said this many times now for the last quarter century or so. I see myself as a monk first, then as a practitioner of the Nālandā tradition of wisdom. At this point, I don't say that I belong to the Hinayana or the Mahayana traditions, but to the lineage of Nālandā, which is rather amazing if you know a little bit about Buddhist traditions. Hinayana and Mahayana are the two major forms of Buddhism on the planet. So, of course, he's a Buddhist, but his main sense of identification isn't even with this or that order or sect or school of Buddhism. It's really with this Nālandā tradition. So what is this Nālandā tradition? That's what I hope to talk a little bit about here in just a few minutes. So Nālandā University, in a few minutes I'll explain why it's called a university. It did start out as a monastery, a Buddhist monastery in 415, but then eventually multiple monasteries in that region were linked together to form the first Buddhist university, or Mahavihara, and this was actually the first university on the planet. And again, I'll be explaining in a bit why it's appropriately called that. It was supported by the revenues of 200 villages, specialized in advanced postgraduate studies, open admissions with a stringent entrance exam, 100 lecterns distributed among different schools, and about 10,000 students and staff. Now, the broader Nālandā tradition expanded in the Pala period a few centuries later. I'll be quoting a couple Indian historians, Sukumar Dutt and Lalmani Joshi, and some other Sanskritists later on. So Dutt says the Pala kings established these Mahaviharas at different centers on the model of Nālandā. There was a system of coordination among them. They were regarded together as forming a network, an interlinked group of institutions. So some of these institutions included Nālandā, Obantapura, Vikramashila, Somapura, Jagadgala, and many others. I'll talk about just a couple of these others. So the area that we're talking about in India is up there, the northeast, and if we zoom in there, you can see those five universities I just mentioned, within a day's travel or so from each other. So faculty and students would oftentimes move between these different university establishments. So Odantapura University was founded by the first Pala king in the mid-700s. It had about 12,000 students and teachers, and had a very important connection with Tibet specifically. In fact, the first Tibetan Buddhist monastic university at Samye in Tibet, something that Francis may speak a bit about, founded by Padmasambhava, was built on the model of Odantapura in 749. It looked like this. This is Samye in Tibet, before 1959. So you can see a very, very large complex with a circular wall enclosing the whole thing and many, many buildings. So Vikramashila University, the other one I'll talk about, founded by the second Pala king, had 108 scholars, maintained by the state. 108 halls, 6 colleges, 53 for esoteric study, that would be tantric study, which I'll talk briefly about, 54 for general use. So they specialize in inner science or tantric theory and practice. And Vikramashila had a very special connection to Tibet. Many Indian scholars of Vikramashila, since its foundation, visited Tibet, which was a very hazardous journey up over the Himalayas. And it also attracted Tibetan scholars from Tibet. There was a detached lodging house. This was the first Tibet house, assigned to Tibetans, according to Dutt. And according to Lalmani Joshi, there were a large number of Tibetan scholars who lived and studied in this college. Vikramashila University gave facilities for the translation of Sanskrit Buddhist works into Tibetan. So keep in mind, this is starting in the 700s. This is going to go on for the next 5 centuries. So the Tibetan preeminence in the Pala period is very important historically in terms of looking at sort of the planetary spread of Buddhist teachings. Nālandā of the Pala period is scarcely represented in Chinese records, which assembled so a fascinating picture of it in its earlier Gupta epic. That's because in those first 300-400 years, a lot of Chinese pilgrims were coming, studying in India, bringing back translations into Chinese, founding Buddhist traditions in India. But everything from 700 on is not really brought over to East Asia. So it is just now beginning to be brought into Tibet, and therefore Tibet is getting the next 500 years. We could actually say kind of the golden years of when this Renaissance culture is really taking off in India. So Tibet, this is all from Sukumar Dutt, Tibet now took the place of China in cultural intercourse with India. At Vikramashila, Tibetan lamas seem to have been held in great esteem. The Indian monks of these Pala establishments seem to have become conversant with the Tibetan language, which is also rather astounding because Sanskrit is an Indo-European language related to Latin and Greek. Tibetan is related to no other language on the planet. It's its own language group. So for them to get to know each other's languages vernacularly in conversation as well as translating was quite a feat. Now, these Mahaviharas were liberal arts universities, as I suggested before. And so again, I'll be quoting from some of these same scholars. Joshi says, these Buddhist monastic colleges were the first systematic educational institutions in ancient India and indeed in the world. They had a truly universal character. They were free from religious, political, national barriers. They threw open their doors to all persons, irrespective of caste, color, creed, or country. Nālandā University seems to have made provisions for specialized studies in almost all branches of learning then known in India, so not just Buddhist studies, as we'll see in a minute. This learning was made available to all seekers after knowledge, Buddhist and non-Buddhist. Thus, the studium generale character of these institutions developed. There were, besides the monks, many lay students interested in studying either Buddhist literature or purely secular subjects. In these Mahaviharas, a reorientation took place. This liberalized culture was the Indian Buddhist culture of that age. The Mahaviharas were both the depositories and the purveyors of this Indian Buddhist culture. This culture then spread to the country from the Mahaviharas. What was their curriculum? Well, among other things, their outer sciences, they had inner and outer sciences and arts, included such subjects as Sanskrit language and grammar, knowledge of Chinese and Tibetan, knowledge of magic, medicine, and the arts and crafts, ability to teach polity, statesmanship, and non-Buddhist studies such as the Vedas, useful sciences such as astrology, astronomy, alchemy, and the ability to compose verse and good praise, according to Joshi. And I would just add as sort of, I think, an important footnote that actually all of these kinds of studies are Buddhist studies. Buddhists themselves don't consider spiritual practice something divorced from or separate from the studies of linguistics and medicine and economics and so forth. All of these other fields, arts and sciences, can and should be taught and studied and harnessed and developed in the service of spiritual principles like Bob was just talking about, wisdom and compassion in particular, making the world a better place, in short. Going on with the curriculum, there was 5 liberative arts and sciences, I would call them, vidyas, that were a common division of knowledge in India at the time. These included Adhyatma Vidya. Now that is inner spiritual arts and sciences. This included advanced technology of self-transformation, yoga, meditation, metaphysics, and psychology, what we probably think of as being sort of Buddhist theory and practice. But it also included Hetu Vidya, or Tarkashastra, that's logic, epistemology, and the arts and rules of debate, something Buddhists are very keen to use to develop. Shabda Vidya, or Vyakarana, including the linguistic, grammatical, and literary studies of Sanskrit language. Number 4, Chikitsa Vidya, medicine and pathology. Buddhists were great doctors. And Shilpastana Vidya, arts and crafts. So now their libraries, they had a huge international significance. Nālandā University Library was the only standard place where foreign scholars and translators from all across Asia could get authoritative texts, according to Joshi. The massive extent of these libraries There were huge multi-storied buildings. One was 9 stories tall, again, unprecedented for the time. King Devapala gave the revenue of 5 villages for the copying of manuscripts, and over the centuries, they came into a huge wealth of manuscripts. Now, surviving Sanskrit literature, that's what we have today, is many times already as large as the Latin and Greek sister language literature together at places like Alexandria. There are as many as 2 million manuscripts extant today, though they are perishing fast. For comparison, there's about 30,000 Greek codices, according to Gombrich, Sanskrit historian. But the original number of Sanskrit or Indic, including vernacular languages, texts, was roughly estimated to be 30 million by Kapilya Vastayan. So, what's the Tibetan Tengyur? That's the Indian context, back and forth for 500 years. So tragically, the magnificent Indian universities and libraries were all destroyed by foreign invaders in a very short time, about a generation or two, in the late 12th to early 13th centuries. But fortunately, by this time, the DNA of the Indic Renaissance culture that had been there for over 5 centuries to develop and flourish and germinate in Tibet. In the 13th and 14th centuries, visionary Tibetan scholars had compiled Tibetan translations of verified Sanskrit texts, which encoded this Enlightenment DNA. So texts had been translated for these 500 years, and when the Tibetans suddenly found themselves sort of holding this cultural heritage, they had to figure out which texts are in Tibet are authentic, which are forgeries, which are sort of suspect. One way they did that is if you could find the Sanskrit original, check with various translators, check with various lamas, authenticated text, it became canonized. The resulting textual collections then were preserved in the Tibetan monastic universities as the Tibetan Kongyurs and Tengyurs. In brief, the Kongyur, Word of the Buddha, these are going to be things as you might think of as religious texts, sutras, the Lotus Sutra, the Heart Sutra, and so forth. So actual records of discourses that Shakyamuni Buddha had, or teachings he gave, or Vinaya talks on ethics and morality and so forth to monks and nuns. Then the Tengyur texts, these are the Shastras. These are written by indigenous Indians. So people in the various universities wrote their own texts, sometimes commentaries on the Kongyur texts, sometimes just their own independent treatises on medicine, philosophy, meditation, and so forth. And there were millions of those. So the Tibetan Tengyur, the numbers that they were able to translate and preserve, consist of about 4,000 plus classical Sanskrit works by over 700 authors preserved in Tibetan translation. At the time, all those Sanskrit manuscripts existed in Tibet as well. Today, maybe 5% are left. So we really only have them preserved in Tibetan, not in Chinese. The vast majority are only preserved in Tibetan. I'll show you some comparative graphs in just a minute. So these were mere drops from the original ocean, but quintessential drops nonetheless. The sections of the Tengyur, the Tibetans created their own cataloging system and organized these texts into 17 categories. You can see the Sanskrit and Tibetan names there. The English equivalent would be poetry, inner science, esoteric commentaries and treatises, transcendent wisdom commentaries, central philosophy, Madhyamaka, outer sciences, phenomenology, and so forth, ethics, letters and accounts, logic and epistemology. So these are the 17 categories of texts within the Tengyur. So if we look at how that sort of spreads out across the different genres, if we stack up folios, you can see a very large stack of folios there under Tantra, esoteric practice, and then supplementary miscellaneous, and then I think that next one is Pramana, that would be logic and epistemology, the Madhyamaka, and then the numbers go down from there. But this is all of the different folios stacked up by category. That's about how that lines up. If we compare this to the Chinese canon, what was translated into Chinese, you can see in the bottom right corner, 6.82%. So they got a lot, and they have very important texts, and it's wonderful to have both Chinese translations and then later Korean and Japanese translations that we can compare to the Tibetan and the Sanskrit, but the Tibetans have many, many more. This is just in the Tengyur. Kongyur is a bit closer. If you look at a graphic image, that's what it looks like. The orange is the Tibetan, the red is the Chinese. On the left, the sutra, what's called sutra genres, that really just means exoteric literature. And on the right, you have tantric genres, more esoteric literature. This is what it looks like by those 17 categories. And you'll notice I don't even put Tantra on there because it would be off the chart times 4. So what is the relevance and impact of translating the Tibetan text of the Nālandā tradition today? We'll return to the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama has said, on the contemporary value and relevance of Buddhist traditions in general, due to their emphasis on reason and explanation, quote, among the different traditions, for those people who are generally a little skeptical about religion, then Buddhists can help. Even among Buddhists, there are still many who are skeptical about a next life in such a period. Buddhism may have greater potential to help such people who love reasons and explanations. Nagarjuna, these are all some of the authors, well-known authors in these represented in these texts. Nagarjuna, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and many of the great masters presented the Buddhist teaching through reasoning and through logic. Therefore, I think these teachings are very relevant to today's world where many people are skeptical about religion. Buddhism can be like a bridge between radical materialism and spirituality. If you ask a more of a faith-based spiritual person further questions, they'll tend to say there's something inexpressible or inconceivable. They sort of rely on faith. Can't really explain it, but I just know it's true. But Buddhism is not that way. All of the great Buddhist masters try to make things clear through reasoning that is based on our own experience. If you're familiar with Buddhist teachings, you already know this. If you're less familiar, this might be a bit surprising. But within the Buddhist traditions, like some of the Greek traditions, there was not this divide between head and heart or faith and reason and so forth. As Dalai Lama talks a lot about this, the idea of faith or inspiration for sure, but it has to be based or grounded in reason, empiricism, and so forth. It can't just be what you believe. So he goes on in another context to talk about the priority of translating the Indian Shastras, specifically those in the Tengyur, emphasizing the importance of their multicultural context we saw back in that quick history lesson. Of course, the Kangyur, the sutras, are important, and those should be translated as well. But for study, for example, with the Prajnaparamita, the Heart Sutra, Transcendent Wisdom Sutras, I think the Tengyur is better, he says. There's a danger that we will hardly be able to understand what's in the Kangyur and the various sutras if we don't translate the Tengyur alongside the Kangyur and depend upon the interpretations from the Tengyur. Tibetan masters, now that's sort of one layer. So you have the Kangyur, then you have the Tengyur commentaries and independent treatises, and then later in history you have all the Tibetan commentaries and treatises. So at that third layer, the Tibetan masters' writings that come later were written in Tibet for Tibetans. And among Tibetans, there are generally no non-Buddhists. So the Lama or writer in Tibet takes for granted that his writings are meant for Buddhists. Whereas in their Indian writings, Nagarjuna, Chandarakshita, Chandrakirti never take for granted that their audience is only Buddhists, as we saw, because it's such a multicultural community. That's a big difference, and you can see these differences in the way the Buddha Dharma is presented. For example, Shantideva's famous Bodhicharyavatara, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, written in the 8th or 9th century at Nālandā. In that text, it's a spiritual text about what it means to be a bodhisattva, a spiritual hero. But in that text, there's quite often some sort of argument that he represents. And his Indian audience was made up of different traditions. So whereas Tibetan lamas and masters take for granted that their audience was Buddhist, so the way that they present things is a little bit different. So again, one of the reasons why the Tengyur texts are kind of unique, because they were speaking to a global audience, multicultural discipline audience like today's audience. So the relevance of the Nālandā tradition today, one last point on this, on the contemporary value and relevance of the Nālandā tradition in particular due to its developing of reasoning and debate. He says, maybe it's now worthwhile to think about the use of the Buddhist techniques of debate applied to not only just to traditional topics, but to modern subjects. Use those rules, those formats for what counts as a good argument, and apply them to other fields. The masters writing in the first millennium picked up examples of subject matter relevant to those times. Now times have changed, so maybe we can use the same methods, but with different subject matter. For example, subjects that are currently important, including economics. Something the Dalai Lama speaks a lot about. Many of you may know he's frequently having conferences with people in neuroscience, cognitive science, AI, biology, cosmology, etc., looking at what kind of synergies can there be there. And the Tengyur text can really help with that synergy. My belief is, he says, the Buddha Dharma in general, and particularly the Nālandā tradition, is very relevant to today's world. So, last couple slides here. What would be the impact of translating this corpus today? Well, Nālandā tradition texts, as we saw, were developed and refined in a cosmopolitan, multicultural, multilingual milieu over many centuries, in a Renaissance Enlightenment culture, in liberal arts institutions using multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches and paradigms for diverse audiences, both religious, in quotes, and secular, Buddhist and non-Buddhist. And so for maximum impact, our translation group and many others would argue, contemporary translations of these texts should appropriately reflect this. They should be developed for a multicultural global target audience, using multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches, referencing and interrelating to contemporary intellectual traditions, disciplines, practices, methodologies, thinkers, terminologies, and so forth. And lastly, dedicated, skilled practitioners, scholar practitioners, hyphenated term that Buddhists use frequently, are now, today, in a unique position to accelerate the completion of such massive projects as translating the entire Tibetan Tengyur. There is an enormous global pool of talent and unprecedented technical resources at our disposal, and more being developed every week. We can and we must reveal the treasures of this Nālandā Renaissance tradition to the world by creating contemporarily relevant, accessible, inspiring translations and studies of these Nālandā texts. Our world needs this now. By doing so carefully, responsibly, authoritatively, and yet efficiently, hopefully with AI, we can make significant contributions toward ushering in a truly global Renaissance culture. Thank you.